Sure. Short version, really wanted to be a prospector after reading a single book when I was 17 called Klondike by Pierre Berton. Kind of a well-known Canadian author, back in the, and he's actually from Dawson City, Yukon, but he lived in Toronto most of his life. But reading that book, Klondike, it just filled my head with these images of finding gold or prospecting. And that story of thousands of people dropping whatever they had and going to the Northwest with no access, no roads, no infrastructure. They dropped everything and they went, and that was the power of gold. And that just blew my mind. So from that day, that's the only thing I ever wanted to do, because I couldn't play in the NHL, I wasn't good enough. So, what else are you gonna do? So the mining industry seemed like a really good alternative. And I went to Concordia in Montreal, Department of Earth Science, and graduated. But I've always really worked as a prospector. So geologist BSc by academic credential, but have always worked for, my own ventures. And prospecting, the biggest thing I was thinking about the whole 4 years at Concordia is where am I going to go and where am I going to live? And Dawson City was still in my mind, Yukon. But I went to visit it, and I thought, wow, you've really got to love winter, and I do. But Yukon is like an order of magnitude more extreme, which also means your prospecting season in the summer is actually very short. Whereas I came to Val-d'Or on a field trip with Concordia, to look at just different rocks, mines, prospects, surface outcrops, visit the local ministère, their office. And it blew my mind. So I just loved Val-d'Or on site. And I thought, well, that's where I'm going to move, So I moved here on graduation day. And, we've pretty much worked exclusively on our own ventures, not just in gold. So we worked in nickel, copper, platinum group elements in Nunavik, Quebec, with one public company. And then that was bought by the Chinese. And then decided, well, we're going to do something else now. So we focused on gold right here in Val-d'Or. And that project has become part of Canadian Malartic that you went to visit earlier today. In fact, the head frame that you would have seen under construction called the Odyssey Mine, that's in the middle of the property that we had staked and later optioned to Osisko Mining, as it was called back then, around 2004. And Osisko did a fabulous job developing the project and discovering additional resources. And then Agnico Eagle and Yamana bought it around 2014. And they later bought or transacted with Abitibi Royalties, which was our company that owned the project. And that created the royalty. And then Abitibi Royalties and Golden Valley Mines were both sold to Gold Royalty Corp this past November. And Gold Royalty is actually listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So going from claim posts in the woods in Malartic to a royalty and a NYSE listed company. It's kind of a neat twist to a traditional, conventional prospecting story. And pretty much all of the work was done by arm's length third parties. So either Osisko or Agnico Eagle and Yamana Gold, who are the operators now. We actually didn't break a rock or drill a hole or do anything after acquiring the property. We didn't have to. Our partners did all of the hard work for us. And so that's the sort of the short version of how we ended up in Val-d'Or and what we're still doing here. And every year that I've been here, I like to say the potential gets greater. When I first moved here, people said, well, it's been around for 50 years. There's probably better places. The gold must almost be all gone and mined out. The mines are getting bigger. The production statistics are going up every year. If you've spent more than 24 hours in Val-d'Or, you've seen the economy, how robust it is, and how the biggest problem is there's no services and service industries left because they've almost all lost their employees to mining companies. And mining companies in the far north fly in, fly out operations. Val-d'Or's biggest problem is having human resources to accommodate the needs of its population because everybody works in the mining industry. And, you know, it's fabulous if you work in the mining industry. It's not so fabulous if you're working in the restaurant or tourism industries or, you know, landscaping businesses or anything where you need seasonal workers because they're not available. They all work full-time in the mining industry now, pretty much anyway. Anyway, it's a great place to live, great place to raise a family, and raised 3 daughters in Val-d'Or, so, you know, it's been great. Val-d'Or is just a fabulous community. Good hockey team too.
And if you could expand on the difference between a prospector and the alternative would be just a person that works a geologist. What would be the, you know, what are the main differences? And I think it's in the mind frame.
Well, it's more than that because a geologist is more, well, first of all, it's academic credentials. So a Bachelor of Science, a degree from a recognized university or academic institution. And most geologists work for mining companies in a very conventional capacity. So that might be as a project geologist or an economic geologist or a resource geologist, or they might work for, you know, the town or the province doing, you know, geoscience mapping, geotechnical work. They might work in civil engineering. There's lots of technical, hydrogeotechnical needs for geologists in engineering, construction, etc. But in the mining industry, I mean, geologists are normally employed by mining companies in exploration, development, and production. So they typically measure, they quantify, they bring science to, you know, the earth sciences. And it's very, I can't say it's rigid, but there are specific rules and regulations for how geologists report in particular and how information is cataloged and quantified. Whereas a prospector, it's kind of rock and roll. Everything goes and anybody can call themselves a prospector. You don't need a degree. Some of Canada's and the world's best prospectors were never geologists and don't know geologists and don't believe in any of the geological criterion. They just go out and break rocks and do things. And many of those people, either through good luck or good experience, have had some of the best success, partly because perhaps they're not constrained by boxes and they don't have to follow protocols. They can just go and do things because they want to. So maybe gold exploration on Monday and critical and strategic minerals on Tuesday, battery minerals on Wednesday, nickel on Thursday, who knows? But a prospector can pretty much pick what they want to do every day. And prospecting is great fun also because you can typically come up with some wild, original ideas and test them just because you want to. Whereas a geologist would have a harder time doing that. He would normally have to convince superiors at a mining company and require budget approval. And there's more of a process to follow for a geologist to test some wild ideas. So we try to do that. We don't do it every day of the week. That would be pretty risky, but we do take some wild chances on, you know, data. So when we find geophysical anomalies that are in virgin areas, virgin meaning untested, so nobody else has done it before. When we find targets that are untested, geochemistry, geophysical, interesting geology, we always look to see what the previous history is and if it's been done before, because you're wasting your time. If you're going to do the same work that's already been done, you'll reach the same conclusions. Maybe the dollar value is different, but the conclusions technically, scientifically, will likely be the same. So we try to eliminate any risk that there's been previous work, and once we're satisfied that it's a bona fide target then we'll take chances on things, and that becomes a key part of our exploration strategy. Subject to some constraints, one of which is, the Abitibi Greenstone Belt. That's where we're based. Val-d'Or is more or less in the center, at least of the Quebec side of it. And there are two principal structures here. The one that goes through Val-d'Or, and the reason Highway 117 is there and called La Route des Prospecteurs is because it's basically following the Larder Cadillac Break, as it's called, which is a fault zone that goes over 250 kilometers from Val-d'Or to Matachewan, Ontario. And every one of the mining camps from Val-d'Or, Malartic, Cadillac, Rouyn-Noranda, Kirkland Lake, Virginia Town, Larder Lake, Kirkland Lake, and Matachewan, they're all separated by about 20-25 kilometers. And so why is that? Why are those mining camps separated by 20-25 kilometers? And every one of them has multiple mines, so not just one. Kirkland Lake had 7. Val-d'Or historically has had probably more than 7. And, collectively, there's about 80 million ounces of gold that's been mined from within 3 kilometers of that straight line. So I always thought that was fascinating just by itself. So what about the areas that are just outside that 3 kilometers? Nobody else has really found anything, and probably with good reason, probably because, that's Mother Nature's controls. So we do look at some of the areas that are beyond those traditional limits, but we also stay focused on what is known. And so we do look at a lot of the areas that become available through the Mining Act. After a certain period of time, claims expire, they become available for staking, and we acquire a lot of projects within that window. And the same is true for the other parallel structure that's about 60-70 kilometers north of here, called the Destor Porcupine Fault Zone, which is basically the source of the gold in Timmins, Ontario. So from Timmins, you go from Timmins to Matheson, Ontario, and then you cross the border into northwestern Quebec, and there's really no significant large communities on the Quebec side because it's all covered by swamp. And so that's of interest to us too. We look at the geophysical profiles on that area under the swamp, and that's become a key focus. I just showed you some rocks from Courville Township. That's right in the middle of that area that's straight north of Val-d'Or, in an area that's had a fair bit of exploration, including some very promising prospects that have been uncovered, but no significant mines on the Quebec side yet. And so that's part of what we're inspired to keep looking at. So there's the Destor Porcupine Fault Zone, the Larder Cadillac Fault Zone, and then the other thing we do is we look at lots of geophysical and geochemical targets wherever they may be. So anything, if it's unexplained, well, why is it there? And why is it nobody else has looked at that in the past? And how much would it cost to actually go and look at that? And, those are the kinds of things that sometimes, geological books are full of reasons why this is true, reasons why that cannot be, this is what you should do, but usually that's based on an abundance of evidence after something has happened. But it's better, I think, to be in front and to be the reason that something happens. So to go and find that, then they'll write geological textbooks about that 50 years from now. And that's kind of what Canadian Malartic has done, because it really changed a lot of the rules, mostly because it's also on the south side of the Cadillac Break. Most of the mines are on the north side of the Cadillac Break. And so, until you test ideas, you really can't hope for any success. So we do look at different commodities, different strategies, different rock types or stratigraphies, and we bring very conventional methods. So the methods we use are very traditional and conventional in the mining industry: geophysics, geochemistry, geology, mapping, prospecting, drilling, etc. And we do that with a variety of commodities. We're not gold only, so we definitely look at any commodity that's of economic interest.
And you're not only in Val-d'Or. You've got other projects, like if we went through the billboard that's right behind you, we have Val d'Or.
International Prospect, because of the name, is one that we deliberately use for testing the same types of ideas outside Canada. And right now, that's exclusively in Australia. And why Australia? Because it always seemed like a really bad business plan to me to focus on raising, say, $1 million Canadian dollars, click your finger, go to Nevada, and now it's 700,000 US dollars. Now you start exploring, and all of a sudden you're gonna have to raise another million, which is US dollars, which is like 1.45 Canadian million dollars. Just seemed like a bad business plan to me. You basically have to find a mine every week. Whereas Australia is one of the few places in the world where $1 Australian Canadian dollar is actually not at par, it's superior to that. So it's very attractive to me economically to work in Australia. 1 equals 1, more or less. And in fact, the benefit is on our side. But more than that, Australia is very pro-mining. So just as, you know, there's a group in Vancouver called the Fraser Institute that annually rank potential and prospectivity of different environments around the world for the mining industry. And they consistently rank Quebec and Ontario in the top 10. Quebec has been as high as number 2, I think, and as low as, you know, number 8 to number 10 a few years ago. But typically it's in the top 5. And Ontario usually ranks favorably. It's around number 10, which means 2 of the top 10 are really our core for Canada. And Australia in general, but Western Australia in particular, is actually number 1. And so why is it number 1? And when you read about their fiscal policy, their incentives, the way they stimulate the economy, and most of it's a desert. Mm-hmm. So just like the Quebec government after World War II figured out that what else are we going to do with these swamps in the Abitibi? And they really focused on the development of natural resources, forestry and mining, to create prosperity, jobs. And it's worked in northern Quebec. Well, Australia has done the same thing with Western Australia. They basically looked at it and said, what are we going to do with this desert and all this red earth? And it turned out that that's where the iron mines are. And they're the number 1 producer of iron ore in the world, and it goes straight north to China. And so China's steel industry is largely fed by Australia's mining industry, and that's created Australia's prosperity and jobs. You know, imagine if you think of the biggest highways in Canada, like the Carrie Expressway in Montreal and the Don Valley Parkway or the Gardiner in Toronto or the 401, how wide they are, how many lanes there are. In Western Australia, there's a place where there are 11 sets of train tracks operating 24 hours per day. They have the record for the longest train in the world, over 7 kilometers long, completely filled with iron ore, automated, 100% automated, going non-stop. That's the power of Australia's mining industry feeding China's steel industry. And it's why Western Australia's economy has boomed. So the other thing I thought was interesting for IZZ, for International Prospect Ventures, is there's a geologist from Vancouver who came up with this clever idea, I thought, you know, without getting into geology, plate tectonics. It's the way that the world was billions of years ago, specifically 2.7 billion years ago, where he had figured out that, well, just as it's true that Africa fits snugly into South America, I think everybody that's ever looked at a globe can figure that out. It's also true that Australia fits perfectly onto what is now South Africa. And so that's interesting if you like gold, because South Africa, specifically the Witwatersrand, is the #1 producer historically of gold. You know, the Abitibi has produced over 200 million ounces of gold, but South Africa has produced 1.6 billion ounces of gold. It's #1 by far. So when this geologist came up with the idea that, well, not just Australia, but specifically Western Australia is actually geologically analogous, comparable to South Africa because they were joined. and 2.7 billion years ago separated. So the rocks are comparable, analogous, the stratigraphy is comparable, the geology, it all fits. And then he said, well, if that's true, then there should be gold in this specific general area. But it's like putting a dot on a map like the Abitibi Greenstone Belt. Where does that dot actually fall on the ground? So it took him years, but he suddenly started to find copious amounts of nuggets, gold nuggets. And where do they come from? And what's the significance? But after they found several thousand of those nuggets, well, I thought that was definitely worth looking at. So International Prospect Ventures has made that a focus of sorts. And so it's a pie in the sky idea right now, and we're going to spend some money chasing down that idea and trying to see if our permits actually host gold and have potential for more. And actually we're off to a good start, because in Australia, you've probably seen some of those TV shows that are kind of crazy. These guys with metal detectors running around, beep, 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 beep. Yeah. And so you're allowed to hire those guys and to use their expenditures, because this gold is literally at surface. And we've actually recovered over 200 nuggets from our properties in Australia to date.
So they paid themselves pretty much.
Yeah, they're allowed to keep the gold.
Okay.
They're allowed to keep, as long as they report it and record the locations and use a GPS and take pictures, they don't have to pay tax. And they're allowed to keep the gold. And so we actually had one of our prospectors recover a gold nugget of 7.5 ounces last year from one of our properties. I mean, 7.5 ounces is as big as a golf ball.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal. And so that's the kind of thing that you don't really see in this environment, because the geology is different in Abitibi. But in Western Australia, that's the kind of opportunities that are lying at surface. So I found that kind of inspiring. And so that's going to be IZZ's focus for the next while. And I love that kind of stuff. I mean, that's, maybe it'll end up being broken dreams. Like most of them, but until you test it and until you do it and until you actually satisfy your curiosity, who knows? And I'd feel guiltier if we didn't chase it down, knowing what we know, including the fact that there are nuggets. Like, we're not looking for nuggets, we're looking for what is the source of those nuggets, where do they come from?
Yeah, and but I think the way you're seeing it is actually very true to a prospector, saying, well, everything is there, so let's take a chance, because that's part of. And
you can drive to it. Western Australia actually has fabulous infrastructure. You can drive pretty much anywhere. It is a desert. It's pretty flat. There's not much that grows there, and it's largely uninhabited. So you don't have the problem of social license as much as you would if it was a densely populated environment. Lots of places in the world have great geology, like California, but it'd be very difficult to develop an open pit mine in Sacramento today. I mean, people would go crazy trying to protect their environment. Everybody's, we call it NIMBY, not in my backyard. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of NIMBYs in the world that like mining, and they like the quality of life, and they like their cell phone that's composed of, more than 20 minerals and the rest of it, but they don't want it in their backyard, as long as it comes from somewhere else. And so you don't really have the NIMBY problem in Western Australia like Northern Quebec, because those environments largely exist and are supportive and pro-mining. And so I like those kinds of environments. There's enough risks in the business that you don't really need the risk of, the community being against vehemently opposed. And so we like areas where you at least have a really good chance of having favorable, supportive local communities.
Yeah, and also, since you love the heat, you'll be fine.
Yeah, not so much. Not so much. No, as soon as it gets above 15, 18 degrees, I start to hide in the basement or think about going north.
So you're not going to be going to Australia often? But
No, I went just before COVID. That was our last trip. And we were in a place called Marble Bar, which has a great big sign as you enter town, and it's electronic because it measures the heat in Celsius. Okay. And they hold the Australian record for heat, and I think it was plus 51 Celsius. Okay. But on the day we were there, they called it cold because it was plus 35. And I mean, plus 35, my hair sweats. I can't breathe, but it was fascinating to see, because just like the people that live in Val-d'Or, I've never heard anybody complain about winter. People love it. They're outside all the time. They've got skidoos and, you know, all the winter toys, and people love being outdoors. And same in Australia. When you get to Marble Bar, just everybody's outside. They're doing their thing, prospecting, exploring, you know, just out in the outback, doing their thing, chasing kangaroos, all the rest of that.
And some of your other project, you were talking about Cleghorn. What's Cleghorn all about? Or it's not yet determined?
No, Cleghorn, it's listed. Its ticker symbol is CZZ. I mentioned to you it's named after the first Montreal Canadian who was suspended for violence on ice, Sprague Cleghorn, and he's actually in the Hockey Hall of Fame. He was a brilliant defenseman in the 1920s. He was also captain of the Boston Bruins for a certain period of time after his term in Montreal. He really didn't like the Ottawa Senators, the original Ottawa Senators from the 1920s. I think I read that for 14 straight years he had a fight in every game against the Ottawa Senators. I just thought it was intriguing when I read about the guy. And he had a brother named Odie Cleghorn, and Odie also played for the Montreal Canadiens. And Sprague and Odie were two Irish guys from Montreal, so that was kind of inspiring also, because our family kind of come from that environment, that clique in NDG and so on, and Hudson. I just loved the story about Sprague. So anyway, that's the origin of the name, but Cleghorn is looking for its own focus project. We did our what's called qualifying transaction, which is in Matachewan, Ontario. I mentioned it's not too far from here, just across the Ontario border. But, you know, we're looking at pie-in-the-sky ideas, looking at all kinds of opportunities, and I'm not shy to tell you that one of the ones I've been reading about for the past few months is focused on Ukraine. And so the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, I mean, I assume it will eventually end, and that however it ends, eventually there will be a massive rebuild. And I just became curious, why is it the Russians were so focused on eastern Ukraine, Donbass, the area that's been in the news every day? You know, and it's no coincidence that the steel mill in Mariupol was located there, because the iron mines are located in that general area. And so the steel industry was largely focused there, and the Russians want resources. Most wars are about religion or resources. And so I thought that was intriguing and kept reading about the geology in Ukraine, and we're working our way through that right now, trying to figure out if there's an economic opportunity that a very small company could maybe participate in the future. So nobody can do anything right now, but they still have a ministry website and a ministry that's still functioning in Kyiv that is responding to questions and emails. And you know, I encourage anybody to look it up, called Ukraine Invest. And they respond to questions, and they most definitely are interested in foreign investment. And I don't know if that'll be Cleghorn's focus project or not, but I hope so, because I think that would be a really inspired project if we were able to put something together. So been talking to lots of different people, both Canadian Ukrainians and Ukrainians, you know, from the diaspora through Europe and the rest of it, many of whom are displaced because of the conflict, and trying to figure out, if we do move ahead with a venture like that, what would a board of directors and management look like, and who could be the likely candidates. And so we're working our way through that part of a potential outcome now. Who knows? Maybe it'll end up being something completely different, but you know, that's what a lot of this stuff I've been reading in the past 3 months is about.
Okay, that's out of left field, but yet, you know, very much apropos. You're following the, you know, you're following the everything that's happening right now.
Well, like everything else, they do have iron mines, they do have coal mines, they do have germanium production. They're one of the world's top producers. They have a number of commodities that they're actually very well situated in terms of the world's production statistics, except it all ground to a halt because of the conflict. But the conflict will end someday, and I assume there will be a massive rebuild. Who pays for it and how does it happen? I have no idea, but that's for tomorrow. For today, Let's get our geotechnical information up to date and figure out what the potential is, and is there an opportunity for a very small company? And always thinking that it has to be something that we can afford to do. There's no point in going into something that requires billions of dollars, because Cleghorn does not have that capacity. But Cleghorn could and would acquire permits and could and would do exploration and advance them to a different stage to attract larger partners. That's the typical way that we try to do everything in Val-d'Or, in Australia, and potentially Ukraine, I hope.
So after 36 years, you're not looking for, to eventually end up in a cushy job of a very large corporation. You still have that fervor of going out there and getting your hands dirty and trying to...
I think one of the other differences between prospectors and geologists is I've never heard of a prospector retiring. Never heard of one. Most of them that I know, including a legend around here called Peter Ferdeber, who was actually the reason I moved to Val-d'Or. I had read about him when I was at Concordia University. There were multiple gold discoveries and deposits that seemed to be attached to his name, including one in Val-d'Or called the Ferdeber Mine, which was owned by Balmoral Mines back then. And I kept reading about this man, and I called him while I was at Concordia, just out. How hard is it to find somebody named Ferdeber in Val-d'Or? Called directory assistants, and within an hour I was talking to him. And he said, and it was probably the best advice I ever had, you've really got to come here. You've really got to come to Val-d'Or to figure it out. Because I could explain it to you on the phone, but you'll never understand. But you have to come here. And I thought that was probably the best advice I ever had in my life, because after I came here, this was the place I wanted to live. And for all those reasons, opportunities, supportive municipality, good infrastructure, it's a community that's so pro-mining, because every family has somebody that works in the mining industry, and many families, everybody works in the mining industry. And everything is somehow related to that, from health services in Val-d'Or. The reason our health services are so good is largely because the mining industry has demanded, facilitated, and partially paid for a lot of that infrastructure. The education system, we have a university and a cégep in Val-d'Or. I mentioned our brilliant hockey team called Les Foreurs de Val-d'Or. We've produced so many players that have gone on to the NHL, including Brad Marchand, Christopher Letang, Roberto Luongo, to name 3 of the nearly 40. There's been so many things that are positive around Val-d'Or, but it's largely because of the mining industry. And prospectors just don't retire. They love doing what they do. And Peter Ferdeber, who I had mentioned, he'd retired, moved to Gatineau, couldn't stand it, and came back to Val-d'Or when he was in his 80s, and he was prospecting until the day he left us. And his son has worked here at formerly Golden Valley Mines. And, his family have all gone on to continue largely working in the mining industry. But that's a classic example of a guy who came as the son of immigrants to the Abitibi region. I think it was from Croatia originally. They moved to Abitibi, worked in the mining industry. He grew up in it, had great success, but just loved it. So I don't know any prospectors that work in prospecting for money. They work in prospecting because they love it, because it makes their tail wag, if you use the metaphor of a dog. What makes a dog happy? Well, a bone. Well, what makes a prospector happy? It isn't even finding something, it's looking for something. Whereas geologists are very different. They're largely motivated by economics, and they work a more traditional, conventional schedule. I won't say 9 to 5, but that kind of comparison. And they typically do have a retirement, and they tend to be happy about their retirements. And so that's very different in sort of the way you look at things and the way you look at the world.
Well, Glenn Mullan, thank you very much for all that knowledge, all that information, and anybody that wants to stop by.
Anytime. If you got a bag of rocks, bring them by. Yeah, that's what we do. We like rocks.